Let's get started, please. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the program on constitutional government. And our speaker today is Howard Husock, who's a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, where he served as vice president for research and publications. He directs the Institute's Tocqueville Project, which includes the annual Civil Society Awards and Civil Society Fellows Program. And he's come here to talk about his book, which has this exciting title of Who Killed Civil Society? The Rise of Big Government and the Decline of Bourgeois Norms. And he wrote a book on philanthropy under fire before 2013, and the $1 trillion housing mistake, the failure of American housing, that was in 2003. Howard Husock was a director of case studies at the Kennedy School, so he knows Harvard. He's no stranger here, and he's written many articles and for journals, newspapers, Wall Street Journal, National Affairs, New York Times, Times Magazine, Society, Chronicle of Philanthropy, Journal of Public Policy Analysis, and so on. Others too. And also, before that, he was a broadcast journalist and documentary filmmaker for WGBH in Boston, where his work won 3 Emmy Awards, including a National News and Documentary Emmy in 1983. So with this career and with this very recent book, he's going to talk today on it's reformative versus...
Formative versus reformative.
Yeah, all right.
The relative roles of civil society and government.
Thank you for reminding me.
Thank you for asking.
Right. But, all right, so that is a more academic way of saying who killed civil society.
That's true.
All right. So, Howard.
Thank you so much, Harvey. It's so great to be back at this oasis at the university. I used to have the great privilege of attending regularly when I was at the Kennedy School, and it was an oasis for me. I would just say that there are faces that were around the table then that are no longer here. I think particularly of Nat Glazer, and I wish he were here. Steve and Abby Thernstrom, Ruth Weiss, she's still with us, so are the Thurnstroms, but they're not here. And so there's some bittersweetness to being here. And so it may seem odd to have a program on civil society awards that I direct, having written a book called Who Killed Civil Society, but I'm going to have to let you guys figure that out after my talk, how I can live with those contradictions. So I read about teaching in the university, and even though I'm not teaching in the university right now, so I figured I better be careful. And so just to show you that I'm keeping up with the times, I'm going to start my talk today with a trigger warning. I'm going to be discussing bourgeois norms. So those of you who agree with Marx, Mao, the Khmer Rouge, that the bourgeoisie are fundamentally a problem, Bernie Sanders, you're trigger warned. I'm going to be defending bourgeois values and virtues. And so for those of you who might think that doing so carries the implication that a culture based in bourgeois norms is to be preferred, well, I suppose that's another trigger warning. But here's what I'm going to say as well, in a more positive frame, that throughout American history, until rather recently, bourgeois norms and their virtues were understood not to be elitist, but rather to be broadly inclusive, a bedrock of American culture to which newcomers and the poor should be introduced, to whom they should be promoted as the keys to self-improvement, upward mobility, and life satisfaction. But as its title implies, my book charts a decline in this promotion of bourgeois norms, and it links it to a broad social transformation, and particularly a changed and expanded role for government. I really should say expanded and changed role for government, which is itself linked to a diminished role for our civil society institutions, including the faith-based and the faith-inspired. It's obviously an exaggeration and hyperbole for the purposes of my publisher to say that civil society is dead in the United States. It's not, but it's been transformed, I argue in the book, and I'll discuss how that's happened and why I think that it's atrophied in important ways. For those of you who would like a reminder about what a society that really kills civil society looks like, just remember everything that we take for granted in the United States and call civil society is illegal in China. So churches, YMCAs, going door to door to get people to sign up to save the planet. No, it's all illegal. So we have to savor all of that, and we still have a lot of it. I start the book with a story I wrote almost 20 years ago for City Journal entitled How the Agency Saved My Father. It was a story based on a sort of a mystery. What had made it possible for my father, who lost his mother at age 5, his father at age 10, in the depths of the Depression in row house, South Philadelphia, to make his way upward into the post-war suburban middle class. As I put it then and again in the book, the greatest mystery of my childhood was that of how my father had survived his. Stories of how he and his sister were at times literally hungry and homeless were mixed with his casual references to something he called the agency. Well, the agency fixed my teeth. It bought me a suit for my bar mitzvah. And most important, it sent a volunteer from Rittenhouse Square, then and now the best of neighborhoods in Philadelphia, to check up on conditions in the foster home in which it had placed him. It took a log search through dusty files in the pre-internet era to find out that he'd been looked after by an organization called the Juvenile Aid Society, a Jewish charitable group supported entirely by private funds and largely staffed by volunteers like Mrs. Sternberger, who literally came in a chauffeured black limousine to check up on my father, to make sure he had his own room, a place to do his homework, and that he was in good health. I learned moreover from these records about the agency's approach. It gave specific instructions as to what these friendly visitors were to discuss and to make sure my father understood. I'm sure they asked how you're doing at school and all those kind of things, but they also had a list of what I would call norms to emphasize. Here's the list: self-respect, living according to fine and high principles, the meaning of honor and confidence and trust, self-control and self-government, the meaning of truth and honesty and other cardinal virtues, good manners everywhere, and the reality of the moral law, which cannot be violated without severe penalties. Finding this list included in mimeographed minutes of agency meetings suggested for me a broader mystery that became the second building block, really the key building block of the book. How was it that such virtues, a list of such virtues, has come to sound dated, patronizing, pretentious, or worse, irrelevant, or aspects of oppression? Some might view the inculcation of such values as at best beside the point. Upward mobility, economic success are simply a function of how well and how fairly the overall economy is functioning. Or that such lists overlook the specific problems of specific households, which need clinical assistance. I realized that the Juvenile Aid Society's list of virtues reflected a different view, one that had taken shape well before my father's youth, that exposing the young, the immigrant, and those of modest means to the bourgeois virtues was a way to introduce them to the tools with which to build a better life. Long before my father was born in 1925, this was a well-established American tradition carried on through faith and family, and at a particularly American departure, secular civil society, that part of organized civic and community life built around private institutions. Think of the Boy Scouts, think of the YMCA. Our civil society tradition of working to uplift the poor is long and deep. Long before there was an agency to help my father, there was Charles Loring Brace, a Protestant minister who founded in 1852 the Children's Aid Society in New York. He was a Protestant minister, but he included Catholics and Jews on his board. He sought to impress upon newsboys, later made famous in Broadway's show Newsies, that gambling and dishonest dealing were not a reliable route to prosperity. The alternative was honest hard work. He reprinted his remarks in his 1873 biography, talk about a title, The Dangerous Classes of New York and 20 Years' Work Among Them. This is what he told the residents of his famous Newsboys lodging house on Manhattan's Duane Street. If you are selling papers, be fast and quick. Do honestly by everyone who deals with you. Work early and late, and you will begin to save money. Then they could earn interest on their savings in the bank that he provided at the lodging house. This is the way that many acquire wealth, by constant saving and hard work. And at any rate, whether you are rich or not, you make an honest living and have no reason to be ashamed of your business and no fear of the law. He cited Abraham Lincoln and John Jacob Astor, among others, as examples of men who advanced by slow, steady steps. And he told his boys, you can do the same. You may not reach as high, for you may not have as much talent, but you can win a respectable position for yourself. Later, in the 1890s, there was Jane Addams, whose Hull House on the west side of Chicago sparked a movement that peaked in 1914 with more than 400 settlement houses, each deeply local and private, helping immigrants and their children, and this was still the largest wave of immigrants proportionally we've ever had in this country, learn English, participate in politics, become citizens. As Addams explained in a paper for the American Academy of Social Science in 1899, the American settlement has represented not so much a sense of duty of the privileged toward the underprivileged as a desire to equalize through social effort those results which superior opportunity may have given the possessor. This did not, she stressed, mean asking people to turn their back on their own cultures. One thing seemed clear in regard to entertaining immigrants, she wrote, to preserve and keep whatever of value their past life contained and to bring them in contact with a better type of Americans. Whew. African Americans led their own settlement house movement, even in the midst of deep Jim Crow. There was in Atlanta the Neighborhood Union, founded by Lugenia Burns Hope, the wife of John Hope, the president of Morehead College. She and her colleagues, notes her biographer Jacqueline Rouse, Victorian in beliefs and values. They believed that the uplift of the race was intrinsically bound to moral uplift. Members of the Neighborhood Union believed that poverty and the lack of proper instruction and supervision were factors that led young people to pursue lives of crime. They concentrated on capturing young adults before they became victims of vice. They regarded the heart of their task as teaching refinement, culture, self-esteem, self-control, manners, morals, and high character, not just through written text, but by example. Imagine they're doing this in the deep Jim Crow South. They still had such optimism about America that they offered that in a neighborhood where the roads weren't even paved. Mary Richmond, considered the founder of what would come to be called social work, wrote in Friendly Visiting Among the Poor, 1899, she recommended specific ways to go about restoring a tone of sturdy self-reliance and independence among the poor. Visitors could exercise a formative influence, that's why I gave the talk this title, by forming a library circle with a group of neighborhood children, meeting regularly to discuss books with them and get well acquainted. She named a striking range of civil society institutions that could also be helpful in imparting norms: fresh air societies, Sunday schools. Indeed, it's worth pointing out that all those that I've mentioned were inspired by religious faith to undertake their work, but did not seek overtly to proselytize. But beginning in the Progressive Era, the sheer hardships and economic inequities began to overtake concern about empowering the poor through exposing them to bourgeois norms. This concern was not misplaced. I want to stress this. This was an era pre-New Deal, before workmen's compensation, unemployment insurance, public assistance for the desperate. At first, the idea of creating what we today call a safety net was not inconsistent with a focus on individual self-improvement. As Mary Richmond put it in a subsequent book, Social Diagnosis, mass betterment and individual betterment are interdependent. She warned that personal and social causes of poverty are interconnected and form a tangle that no hasty, impatient jerking can unravel. Friendly visitors and all who are trying to improve conditions in poor homes should welcome those who are studying trade conditions and other aspects affecting the welfare of the poor, but they should not permit themselves to be swept away by enthusiastic advocates of social reform from that safe middle ground which recognizes that character is at the very center of this complicated problem. Character in the rich, who owe the poor justice as well as mercy, and character in the poor, who are masters of their fate to a greater degree than they will recognize or than we will recognize for them. Such views did not prevail. Government, indeed the federal government, would come not only to create a range of financial assistance programs to fund our welfare state, but would do the same for a wide range of programs which would be delivered by what had been independent civil society organizations privately supported. These would become, quote unquote, service providers, no longer disseminators of values, but providers of services for clients seeking to cure rather than to avert. That's a phrase that Charles Loring Brace used. They would be drawn into what I'm calling the social service state, as distinguished from the welfare state. Key figure in this history was Grace Abbot, a protege of Jane Addams and part of the Hull House Progressives Network, who turned away from the faith-inspired values approach with which they had started and looked to government instead. Abbot was the daughter of a Nebraska frontier lawyer. Her father was a close friend of Abraham Lincoln, a Republican even in the William Jennings Bryan, Nebraska era. She started as a Nebraska school teacher. She attended the University of Chicago, however, and set off on a different path, crucially as the head of a new kind of federal agency, the Federal Children's Bureau, a sort of in-government advocacy organization. In her language and her ideas, she sounds just strikingly contemporary. She envisioned a range of government-supported maternal and child health services formulated on the basis of 7 distinct criteria, including that they, quote, provide for the development of demonstration services in needy areas and among groups in special need. Hire her as a grant writer today and she'd be right ready. She was candid in saying that children were just the beginning. As she wrote, historically, the children or the cause of children has been the spearhead in the struggle for better economic and social conditions, better organization of the government for the service of its citizens. Those who have undertaken to safeguard children must propose what often seems at the time a revolutionary change in the conception and the functions of government, and must experiment with new administrative and judicial procedures. This would mean much more than economic security through counter-cyclical financial support. It would mean government-supported social services focused on rehabilitating the troubled rather than civil society promoting formative virtues, the reformative rather than the formative. In her own time, Abbott's views were well understood to be a dramatic departure from tradition. In 1929, at the Hoover administration's Conference on Children and Families, Dr. Lyman Wilber, the Secretary of the Interior and also involved in the Public Health Service, pushed back against her. He believed there is a public interest in the healthy development of every child, white and black, yellow and red, rich and poor, and all that lies in between. Indeed, he declared, the wretched frame of a little body may have in it the brain and spirit of a Caesar, a Cicero, a Keats, a Washington, a Steinmetz, a Shelley, a Stevenson, or a Roosevelt. bipartisan. It is not for us to foretell the potentialities of a baby. A proper concern of government was to remove obstacles to the realization of the potential. Pointedly, however, Wilber cautioned against a centralization of efforts to help children realize that potential. The aim must be to extend and strengthen those community forces which stand to the child in place of many of the earlier responsibilities of home and parent. Government agencies should not try to replace parents, however. No one should get the idea, he said, that Uncle Sam is going to rock the baby to sleep. Abbot argued otherwise, for federal grants to private groups. Her vision came to fruition slowly. Architects of the New Deal were actually confident that social services would be little needed. It was assumed that once the Depression lifted, most households would naturally become part of the working labor force, and that the role of the state was to provide protection against such exigencies as poverty in old age, disability, and widowhood. They were surprised when, amidst the prosperity of the post-war era, public assistance caseloads began to skyrocket. The Kennedy administration came under public pressure to deal with these rising welfare caseloads. If those receiving public assistance were not evolving into becoming social insurance contributors on their own, then government would have to intervene with rehabilitation and preventive and protective services to strengthen family life and help individuals attain self-support. It talked about waging war on dependency. The weapons of that war would be social services funded by Washington. The troops would be an army of professional social workers. The Bureau of Public Assistance was named the Bureau of Family Services. Washington would deliver what President Kennedy promised when he signed the much unappreciated Watershed Act, the public welfare amendments to the Social Security Act in 1962 that were championed by Wilbur Cohen, whom Kennedy would dub Mr. Social Security. Cohen himself believed that social services would draw the recalcitrant into the workforce. They would then be covered by social insurance and be the beneficiaries of rehabilitation, not relief. Of course, it's a deeply revealing phrase. Rehabilitation implies correction, whether of personal failings or actual wrongdoing. And indeed, the law specified specific failings that government was to address: dependency, juvenile delinquency, family breakdown, illegitimacy, ill health. This is how you qualified for some form of help, by having veered into a troubled path. There's just a vast difference between that list and the list of values carried by my father's volunteer social worker: self-respect, self-control, good manners. And the language of the public welfare amendments was aimed for the effective location of deserting parents, the simplification and coordination of administration and operations to improve the adequacy and consistency of services. The amendments were intended to contribute to the attack on dependency and juvenile delinquency and reduce, and on and on and on, the incidence of those problems. Where once the emphasis had been positive, it was now negative, reformative, not formative. And indeed, many of Wilbur Cohen's army of social workers became convinced that the only way to address the predicament of the urban poor was through increasing public assistance benefits. There's a fantastic profile of a welfare mother written in 1976 in The New Yorker, when that was a quite different magazine, by Susan Sheehan, in which that is the expressed conclusion of those visiting the welfare mother who was running numbers, who was abandoning her children. What she needed was more money from the government. Today, what was once our independent sector, promoting constructive virtues and values, has become an arm of government's efforts to help those who have already made bad life decisions. The scale is really pretty astounding. Some 56,000 nonprofits today enter into some 350,000 federal contracts and grants. The Administration for Children and Families, the direct descendant of the Children's Bureau and the beating heart of the Federal Department of Health and Human Services, disperses $53 billion a year in federal funding, much of it matched by state funding. It boasts that its budget is larger than whole cabinet agencies like the Department of Justice, Interior, and Treasury. By comparison, the entire budget of the Boys and Girls Clubs of America is $1.7 billion, of the YMCA $155 million, and the Boy and Girl Scouts less than $500 million. Faith-based charities have been transformed into government contractors as well, with an inevitable loss in discretion about message and values. The largest single source of revenue, for instance, for Catholic Charities of New York is the $37 million it receives from government sources. Today, the $6 million in fees and grants from government is the largest single source of revenue for the Jewish Children and Family Services of Philadelphia, the successor agency to the agency which helped my father. In its annual report, it emphasizes how it empowers clients by directing them to obtaining public assistance. This reminds us of something we know from the private sector. One's major investor often calls the shots. In the Obama administration, government began something called the Social Innovation Fund, in which it was going to identify nonprofits that were showing the most promising results around the country and reward them with government investment. Not only that, but it asked major private philanthropies to match their investments. So not only was it contracting with what had been private groups, but it was helping to give the government good housekeeping seal to large philanthropy so that it was directing their investments as well. This reminds of the speech that Attorney General Barr recently made at Notre Dame, in which he talked of his recent visit to church, during which a member of his parish's social action committee deplored the extent of the homeless in Washington, D.C., and the importance of soup kitchens to help them. I expected him to call for volunteers to go out and provide for this need, Barr said. Instead, he recounted all the visits that the committee had made to the D.C. government to lobby for higher taxes and more spending to fund mobile soup kitchens. Lost is the intrinsic virtue of voluntarism, which not only helps provide services, but forms social fabric within the communities that are delivering that. Anybody who has volunteered at the local level understands the human relationships and friendships that one develops that may morph into other ways, and the trust that develops. You know, Bob Putnam's research on choral societies in northern Italy is so instructive. What he found was one of the reasons that northern Italy was a more robust and is a more robust economic region was because of the high levels of social trust that were formed by choral societies and other civil society groups that transcended that to have an impact on economic trust. What's more, some federal funding supports organizations which actually market to the poor and disadvantaged the dispiriting message that the deck is stacked against them by structural, social, and economic inequities. If one is told that America is flawed by ongoing systemic racism, it hardly inspires one to strive and save. In both tone and substance, this is a world away from Charles Loring Brace as he reflected on vagrant children and their families. Policy toward the population, he wrote, must include reward for good conduct, success for industry, hope and applause for honesty and virtue, pain and loss and disapprobation for idleness and vice. Such was American civil society before, I argue, becoming distorted by government, before becoming part of the social service states, before progressives, if you will, did their best to kill civil society. They have not, however, wholly succeeded. For the past 20 years, my work, as Harvey mentioned, at the Manhattan Institute has included our annual Civil Society Awards, a recognition of privately conceived and supported group which stand in the Brace and early Jane Addams tradition. Those whom we have recognized include Jeffrey Canada, founder of the Harlem Children's Zone, about whom I devote a chapter in the book, as I devote chapters about Brace, Addams, Mary Richmond, and Grace Abbott. Canada's effort to provide healthy, formative influences on children in a 100-plus block area of central Harlem has relied centrally on the philanthropy of one person, Stanley Druckenmiller, who was George Soros's assistant in their hedge fund. The Children's Zone stands squarely in the Charles Loring Brace tradition, helping young parents learn how best to raise their children helping children succeed in school, running its own charter schools, and then staying in touch with those young people as they move to higher education. Canada is an unabashed fan of bourgeois norms. As he told me, if you're surrounded by people who are always talking about going to college, you end up thinking, well, maybe this is something I can do too. You get contaminated by the idea. He's being sarcastic. If you touch enough kids at the same time with the same message, it won't be unusual to think, I should do well in school. I should speak proper English. I should do my homework. These things won't seem like you're not being from the hood or you're not keeping it real. And the same way that things went bad, I think they can go good. I want my kids growing up with a sense of orderliness and safety, a belief in what I would call, he really says this, the American dream, for kids to believe by working hard that the sky's the limit, that they can go as high as their talent will take them. He's convinced that an atmosphere of aspiration, for instance, will do more to prevent teen pregnancy than a program devoted to preventing teen pregnancy. Other award winners have included, this is just this past year, English is a second language of Northern Nevada, volunteer tutors teaching night casino workers how to learn English and become citizens. The Trade Institute of Pittsburgh, it trains high school students and a large group newly released from prison in masonry and welding. They get good jobs. And I would urge people always ask, well, what can I do about this? And I urge you to support organizations that you really know that you can touch in your local community. I give money to Doctors Without Borders. I'm a soft touch, but I give money to the groups in my community that are trying to help with the kids and their families who overdose from drugs in my community. In the process of learning about the kind of efforts that I celebrate and urge people to support, I learn about an important critique that they face, that such local groups will inevitably fail to go to scale, that government must step in because of, in the way economists talk about market failure, social scientists, notably Lester Salomon of Johns Hopkins, talks about voluntary failure. There just won't be enough volunteers to staff up these large organizations. It's with this idea that I take fundamental issue. I assert that true scale in shaping a healthy society is built on the promotion at the community level of healthy norms. And we have gradually retreated from the promotion of such norms as civil society groups became bound to this social service regimen. We now fund those through the federal funding stream. Norms can spread. Norms are scale. Even amongst those not directly served by an organization, they can be touched by their norms. I think about this lady who came up in a black Cadillac, and the kids on the corner asked my father, well, who's she? And maybe he explained it, and they said, oh, interesting. To reiterate, mine is a book, as the title says, about what I see as the decline of bourgeois norms. And I think we have reaped the whirlwind. Opioid use, suicide, declines the percentage of adults even seeking to be part of the economy. And it can easily get worse should proposals to withdraw the tax-exempt status of religious institutions prevail, or even were the government to become prescriptive, as some propose, as to which organizations truly serve the poor and therefore merit a tax exemption. Exposing the young, the immigrant, those of modest means to healthy norms is the way to help them succeed. We must look to healthy norms and moral renewal, not to replace government programs, but transcend the need for them. Thank you very much.
Question.
We draw the distinction between formative, in which we try to instill norms and values, versus a model of providing services. Isn't one of the problems with the first model that we live in a multicultural society and maybe we don't have agreement on norms? For example, manners, speaking good English, staying in a marriage, all those things I'm not sure we have agreement on, and that's why there's a pushback of people saying that's imposing values, that's oppressive. Isn't that part of what you face?
Well, I think the way I would frame that is that elites which practice those values and which work well for them have lost the confidence to promote them. You know, here's a random, slightly related story. I'm kind of a jazz fan, and I once read a great interview of Charles Mingus in Downbeat magazine. And the interview was rather patronizing. They said, "So tell me, Charlie, what kind of jams are you digging on today?" And Charlie said, "I'm digging me on some Mozart, man." And my argument is there are some things that transcend that kind of pushback. And the pushback, I don't think, is coming from the poor. I think it's coming from misguided elites. And I'm addressing them. Dimitri.
Thanks so much. This was a really provocative, engaging talk. So I think if your story's right, that the expansion of the state kills civil society in the way you described. I remember I was once talking to someone about this sort of topic, and the state kills civil society, and he pointed out, well, if you kill someone, if you pull out the knife, it won't bring the corpse back to life. And so given that these civil society organizations are so dependent on government funds, you know, it's tempting to think if the government just got out of the business, the norms might come back and they might grow. But you also might think so much damage has been done that there's no reason to think those norms are going to come back on their own in some way. So I'm just wondering, do you think that given the role of government, as you tell it, in killing these institutions, that government's role should just be to step back and let things recover, or that government has some other kind of role to play to rejuvenate civil society?
Well, we've had an interesting debate about this since the early Reagan administration. And so Reagan was cutting social service grants. And the private charitable sector pushed back, said, there's not enough money in the private philanthropic and charitable world to make up for this. Of course, they were saying to keep a steady state of what we're doing and what we have been doing with government funding, as opposed to the kind of parallel efforts that I'm talking about. And I think what we've learned, this social service state has not really varied through Democratic and Republican administrations. You know, this $53 billion just keeps going up. So I don't think it's practical. All of these are good causes. Helping the disadvantaged, reducing teen pregnancy, dealing with substance. They're such good causes you can't defund them. Head Start has been demonstrated to be an almost universally ineffective program with results fading out by the third grade. It can't be defunded because it has such a great name. Right? So I think the only thing to do, and that's why I end on the note of how do we transcend it? You know, we have to, if it somehow became the case that substance abuse was no longer a problem because so many people were working effectively at local levels with non-government organizations, well, then maybe it would be plausible not to continue the Institute for Drug Abuse. So it's a kind of a, what do they say in billiards, where you two shot?
Carom?
Carom, yeah. It's indirect.
Big shot.
Bag shot, thank you. Tom.
I'm just wondering about race. I guess that in general, we've made progress over these hundreds of years with steps back and reconstruction at different times, and major progress maybe in the early 60s, trying to do in reality what the laws, the changes and improvements in laws and race and equality, inequality, what the goals were. But along with that came a bunch of cultural changes and well, music and film and that kind of thing, which a lot of which is the antithesis of bourgeois values, and that clearly spills over into the rest of youth and culture. And I just wondered if you addressed that, and I thought about.
Well, I'll address that. I do address it in one way. Jeff Canada, who obviously I have a high opinion of, is approached all the time by rap stars who want to tour his school, have their pictures taken there, and they offer him big money to support it, and he always refuses. Because he said, no, that's not my message here. which is a very courageous act. Not a lot of nonprofits walk away from big money. And so the answer is, you're right, those are pernicious influences. And, you know, I regret that elites, I blame elites a lot. Elites, you know, it goes back to Mao-Maoing the flat culture and Leonard Bernstein patronizing the Black Panthers because they were so amusing, you know, without upper middle class white teenagers buying gangster rap. There's no gangster rap industry, you know, and so I think those parents ought to tell their kids, this is pernicious stuff. So I understand that makes me a social conservative, and I am. Yes?
So the Jeffrey Canada, I think there was an NPR did a special, and that's I derived some knowledge. So if his baby college, is that his?
Baby college.
Yeah, or teach it for parents of newborns, not.
It's not college for babies.
Yes, right. So that works. So how do you scale that? I mean, I think social progressives or whatever, liberal progressives, they're interested in, NPR gave an hour to it, so presumably they're interested too. So how do you scale that, and is it you don't want it to be funded by the government because what loses out? I'm just trying to understand this, because it seems like a thing liberals, they love that.
Right. Two
success.
things. Jeff Canada was a hero of the Obama administration.
Right.
And they were going to use him as the linchpin of something they called promise neighborhoods. And they were going to reproduce the children's zone in 34 demonstration cities, you know. And over time, Jeff Canada became very disillusioned with this and said, do what you want. And he just kind of washed his hands of it. And he concluded that the only way this really happens, first of all, it becomes a whole mess of categorical grants and bureaucracy. He said, the only way this happens is if there's somebody like me in Cleveland, and they get the support of the Cleveland Foundation or other people there, and they have the span of control that I have over the children's zone. Another example, this is a local organization that I help fund, a 90-year-old white guy who lives in Westchester County, New York, where I live, heard that NPR special about Jeff Canada and said, you know what, we should really do this here in this poor community of Latino immigrants. And he did that. He went to Hispanic people in that town, and he put rich white people together and put up the money, and every Saturday morning they've got baby college for young Hispanic mothers, for about 100 of them. You know, and, I don't know what evidence-based policy is going to show in 5 years, but I can't, every week they give them a new book in households that had 0 books. It can't help but help. And so he was inspired by that. And so, since the New Deal, we've become accustomed, and especially the Great Society, that if something is good, as Lyndon Johnson once said, add 6 zeros behind that, son, this is the federal government. And that hasn't worked. Yeah.
Couple of points. One is you talked about the bureaucracy that has grown over these programs. That now represents an entrenched political opposition force to what you're talking about.
Right.
And setting aside the values argument and philosophy, it's just they, as all political entities will protect their own and always be looking for an increase in grants, which makes it very hard. I'd be interested to know how you respond to how you take on that problem. The second part is, all the conversations that we usually have endeavoring to understand problems in society and address them usually involve politics and economics, ideologies. And you're dealing with values, and I found myself sort of almost ill-equipped to handle the issues at that level. And I wonder if it's at all related to also what's going on college campus. There's been a great deal of antipathy against what might be called the Western canon of knowledge and civilization. What used to be called treasures of our culture are now disparaged. I know that my alma mater, Yale, they're just canceling the survey art course. They say it had nothing to do with protesting against emphasis on Western art, but most of us think that same thing happened in the music department. Do you see that connection between what's going on there and this problem with having the loss of what you call bourgeois values?
I'll take the questions in order. There clearly is an entrenched, what Milton Friedman would call tyranny of the status quo, public choice theory, whatever you want to call it. People have professional lives caught up in the world of social service, provision, which is why I say I don't think it's productive to talk about defunding the social welfare state. You're just going to have a whirlwind of opposition. Better to fund ourselves those organizations that are locally tied, locally overseen, and accountable, and that approach things with a more values-based approach. And ultimately, the hope is that over time, like I like to say, I don't know if it hasn't happened that way, but Habitat for Humanity builds all these houses privately. It doesn't get any government money. They've built tens of thousands of houses. And does that diminish the argument for HUD? Well, I think it does a little bit, And HUD's budget has actually not really grown that much in real terms over the last few years. And so I think as other facts emerge on the ground, it may help reduce the argument, right? I mean, the Interstate Commerce Commission existed until it didn't. The Civil Aviation Agency existed until it didn't. And so if facts on the ground change, maybe the support for that entrenched group will change. You get to, now we're getting into a high political science, John Kingdom, will there ever be a window of opportunity for defunding? And a lot of stars would have to align. I agree with that. Now, as far as the Western canon, it's just ironic that the protests are kind of led by people who benefit from, they talk that talk, but they don't walk that walk in their households. And it's the upper middle class, two-parent family that disproportionately send its kids to the most selective schools. And so it's what's going on there psychologically and why that's extended to attacking the basis of civilization that as we know it. Is it a factor? I suppose it is a factor, and you just have to. I think we just have to push back against it and say that it's misguided. Daniel Bell, who used to teach here, wrote The Cultural Contradictions of Capitalism. That seemed to fall into that category. People get to be so well off that they don't think values matter anymore, and that they can turn their back on them, and that the prosperity machine will go on forever for everybody. But it might not be true. Jim?
I have a couple of questions. One is about the relationship between church attendance and government investment, as it were, in social services. Because it used to be that many churches, especially mainstream Protestant churches, before the 1930s were very much involved in providing social services.
Social gospel, too.
So, yeah, and gave people who belong to those churches a great sense of belonging and meaning in their lives to be helping the local community. And it seems to me, everyone who talks about the decline of mainstream churches in America thinks it has something to do with belief or with scientific disproving of Christianity. But I think it seems to me there ought to be a lot of the emptying of the churches must have to do with the lack of purpose these institutions have. And I wondered if there were any studies connecting I'm not in this field at all, but I was wondering if there are any studies connecting church attendance and the decline of churches as centers of social health. That's my first question. My second question is a bit more about how things are structured. And this, it's Lent, and last week I went to church, and the church is raising money for, they handed out these very glossy brochures saying we should all give money to support a diocese in, I think it was North Dakota, that was taking care of Indian tribes, Indian reservations. They're trying to offer, there's apparently some diocese in North Dakota that gives religious services and social services to people in North Dakota. So I asked the priest going, I said, Father Brian, we have the Little Sisters of the Poor literally within stone's throw of this church who need money. And they provide all sorts of social services in Somerville. But why aren't we giving money to them? Why are we giving money to people in Nebraska? He says, well, people want to give money to the Indians. It's sexier somehow to give to minorities or historically disadvantaged people than to give money to Little Sisters of the Poor. And it makes us look good with the archdiocese. Okay? So, because the more money, we give more money, when we have these kind of sexy things we give money to. And that makes us look good with the archdiocese. So instead of giving money to the very local people who are actually helping our community, I find that's really perverse, and it has to do with bureaucratic incentives. That I think maybe that's a place that one could focus policy on, not particularly on the Catholic Church, but on this idea, the idea of sort of bureaucratic incentives for not dealing locally.
Well, I think you may have answered your own questions.
Well, I would still like to know if there were any studies.
I don't know. I would say only that there is, I don't know of any studies asking the question of, the broad, I'm sure there's studies of the broad phenomenon of the decline in church attendance among mainline denominations, whether that's isolated. But there certainly is, a correlation with the change in the causes that are supported. So one sees a lot of advocacy work being supported by churches. At my own synagogue, I was asked last week to go to what we would have called in the 60s a teach-in about immigration. And it was not going to be a discussion about, well, what's a moral and ethical immigration policy for the United States? That's a pretty deep question, even challenging for those of us who think we're pretty pro-immigration, but one wants to take into account the expressed preferences of those who don't think they're in favor of immigration. That's kind of how you work these things out. No, it was about, it's terrible what they're doing on the border, and we're going to hear about that, and so that diminishes one's incentive,
Right.
So I think the abstractness of causes has correlated with a diminution of support for the mainline churches, but
Maybe we're just too prosperous and people don't see the deep need. Maybe too isolated in terms of our communities. We don't see really poor people very often, and most of us who live in middle-class
yeah.
communities.
But I was at I wrote a piece about philanthropy in Texas and what the big mega churches were doing. These very white bread big mega churches have a program for pairing adult males with poor black inner city kids from Dallas, and they take them camping and fishing, and so they understand that themselves to be working directly with people in their own community, and they're really doing it. And so we know those churches are booming.
It's interesting.
Here's a question. I'm wondering whether you wouldn't want to add to bourgeois norms the activity of self-government that goes with the instructing or of such norms.
Yes.
When I hear civil society, I immediately think of Tocqueville, who speaks of associations and the art of association, as if it's not just norms, but it's the practice of democracy, not only through the official or constitutional structure, but also in society itself. So that the very activity of getting together people to associate for a purpose like this has a value in itself for the givers as well as for the receivers.
Right. I do say that, and maybe I should emphasize it more, but I couldn't agree more. I quote Tocqueville, and I probably should quote him more, especially your translation.
Thank you. That was the point of my question.
But, it's not a coincidence that China is so antipathetic to civil society groups, because it's not a democratic society. Mm-hmm. And they understand every small association, every home church, the Falun Gong, who are a little nutty. Why do they think they're such a big threat? Because they associate independently of the government. And that is preparing them to participate, per your question, in some different kind of government.
Well, yes, but they might answer, when we say so, we can lock up our citizens in their own houses and they won't leave in case of a contagious danger like the one we face. And so it's more efficient to have a strong central government. Don't you have to accept a certain reduction of efficiency, or does the way of that you propose have everything in its favor?
Well, I think as it comes to social services, you have to accept a reduction in reach, but possibly not a reduction in grasp,
Mm-hmm.
right? So what appears to be all-encompassing turns out not to be. Now, as to the question about the efficiency of totalitarian states, well, that's a pretty big trade-off if you're a Whigger, right?
All right.
I would say. I used to teach in executive education programs for the Kennedy School in China. We had a relationship with the Beijing government. I was very ambivalent about this. The school was not as ambivalent, I'll just say that. And, I would try, without being too overt, we would speak to mayors and governors, regional officials. And I would remind them of the work of an economist at the Kennedy School, Danny Roderick, who's a rather brilliant person. And he's done all this research that shows over time, democratic regimes are more likely to sustain prosperity. So you have great leaps forward, but then great falls. Mm-hmm. And the steadier climbs with less variation is characterized by democratic regimes. And he analyzes, I don't know, how many countries are there? 154 or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Very convincing.
I know you were hard to convince on that.
Mm.
The natural effect of the media, mass media, is to create the impression that bigger solutions are the answer. And I mean, single payer, and that's not even to mention the political biases of the people working in the media and everything. And I mean, you can't really control the media, I suppose. And I think it's a little better because we have the internet and other people, people without a printing press can express their opinions now. I think that's better than it was in the 80s or something when 3 networks and the New York Times and the Washington Post controlled most everything, and the news magazines. But I just wondered if you talk about, isn't it fighting against a constant battle of this, there's a problem out there, so let's have Washington solve it?
It's funny how these things work, media, and your part, Tom, is very keyed to stories. So at the same time, you can capture attention with Medicare for All. Every year, CNN has a whole series called CNN Heroes. And they're like really little guys doing little stuff in little places. So why are they doing that? Because they want to even things up politically? No, those are good stories. And they respond to doing that too. And so it becomes somebody's job to tell them about those things, and then they, the press responds to what it sees. And if they don't ever see those things, it'll never report about them. But, to see the press and the media as monolithic and, in these Manichaean terms, I just don't think that's constructive. Anna?
Excellent, thank you so much.
Thank you.
But what about the argument that focusing on private giving is fundamentally unfair? It's fundamentally unfair to let those of great wealth direct their monies in private ways.
Good.
Much better to tax them and take that money to be used by the entire body politic in the ways that the body politic thinks are
Right. Philanthropy is
most
anti-democratic.
appropriate. Yeah.
Yeah, great question. How much does all philanthropy amount to in the United States? The answer is about a little south of $400 billion a year. It's about 3% of GDP, and it's held steady at 3% of GDP for a very long time, decades, right? So that's just a rounding error in the federal government. It's so little money. I think of it as a kind of some kind of societal venture fund. I was in Hong Kong once, and I had occasion to interview Carrie Lam, who is now the chief executive. She was running the social service program for Hong Kong then. And I said, well, who takes care of social problems in Hong Kong? Well, we have subvented agencies. That's British speak for subventions, we give you a subsidy. I said, well, what do you do if you hadn't anticipated what the problems are, like coronavirus or something like that? She says, oh, that's easy. Then you look to the non-subvented agencies. Oh, okay, so there are non-subvented agencies. They're philanthropically supported. So it's a way to hedge our bets. I read the Boston Globe this morning, and there's a long op-ed by a group of biomedical related industry people who talk about how Boston biomedical firms are on the cutting edge of developing a vaccine for coronavirus because of, quote, unrestricted philanthropic giving in recent years that allowed them to just do moonshots, right? And everybody knows when you apply for a federal grant and you get the coveted 68% overhead, or maybe it's 72%, which supports Harvard University, there's strings are attached. And so I think the answer is you want to hedge your bets and see what happens. Now, Anna.
I have, no, you're much sweeter, Margaret. I have 2 questions. My first one is the women entering the workforce. What effect did that have on what the fabric of volunteer work? People who had time to do it, who wanted to do it. All the women that I know that work, that have families, it's the last thing they could afford time-wise, right? I mean, it just I don't know, they're already scrambling, so there's no room or in their heads or in their time schedule for this. And then the second question I have is that, you told this moving story of your dad, but for every story like that, how many, especially in that day and age, were there that were utter failures? Like if you visit those tenement buildings and all these places in New York from earlier times, it just seems horrible. And many women were left by their husbands apparently in those days who could just walk out on them, and then there were private charities to support them. But I just don't see how you would want to leave that up to chance and to, as you say, the scale of giving. And you could have opened your talk with with another example, with other people ending up in the gutter or children, whatever, and never ending up as orphans, but you didn't. But there must be countless cases.
Well, remember,
that happen.
I'm not promoting the idea that public assistance should be abolished. Right, or that unemployment insurance should be abolished,
No,
or
I
there should be
understand
a huge retrenchment of the government
I
safety net.
understand that.
I'm not saying that. And, in terms of how social services are effective, we're replete with horror stories about local foster care government entities placing kids who are abused and killed, right? Because you have bureaucrats looking up after them as opposed to either volunteers. Not everything has to be a volunteer either. Just because you're a civil society organization doesn't mean you only have volunteers. It could be that your board is volunteers. And I think a lot of it's true there were, Mrs. Sternberger, who helped my father, was a rich lady who had time on her hands. And there are not as many rich ladies who have time in their hands anymore, I guess proportionally. But a lot of people of means are willing to sit on boards and donate some time. Doesn't mean it's all their time. Has the entry of women into the workforce had an effect? Yes. Has the diminution of the extended family had an effect? On men too, yes. But again, I don't think it means to say that volunteerism, as per Professor Mansfield's question, is an end in itself, is not to say that it's the only means. So, and speaking of tenements, I have in mind another book called The Poor Side of Down in Defense of Slums. So that will address that question. It'll take me a while to get to that. But one thing that I note is that on the Lower East Side in New York, there's something called the Tenement House Museum. And it's lovely. I urge everybody to go see it. There's a little social history of all the families that lived in this one
Right, I was actually thinking of that.
tenement building. But they've reframed that experience by calling it the Urban Log Cabin. In other words, it was the starting point for the rocket ship to prosperity. And the thing I like about the Lower East Side is that the public schools were good, and if you didn't have a private bath, there were public baths that the city built, so, and a lot of neighborhoods that were ultimately bulldozed for urban renewal because they were judged to be so abhorrent to our conscience are remembered very nostalgically by the people who lived there and viewed them as their launching pads.
The West End in Boston.
West End is a great example. See Herbert Gans's incredible book, The Urban Villagers, which is still important.
And the West End Museum. I'm on the board.
Where is it?
Lomonteney Way, right in the West End Place building, a large museum.
Near the New England Society for the Preservation of Antiquities?
Down the street, down, right across from the courthouse.
On Cambridge Street, Lomonteney Way.
O'Neill Courthouse, right near the
Who
garden.
was LeMasney?
Right
Tom?
near the garden. He was a politician.
Yeah, Martin LeMasney, who was a war.
But he wasn't powerful enough, unlike other neighborhoods that had powerful politicians representing him. He wasn't powerful
Because
enough.
it was not ethnically homogeneous.
Right, that's right.
Yeah, terrible. Okay.
As I hear you saying these things, I'm trying to think how this idea could be spread or promulgated. And the best would be if there were some political leader who would get up on platform and instead of blasting the opponents in the other party, or dealing with some of the minutiae of the day, would give a speech on something like this, I sense it probably would resonate well with the community. I don't think that Donald Trump or Joe Biden or Bernie Sanders in the category of being able to do that, which brings up the question of where is the leadership that is necessary in order to, in effect, put forward the idea of values and to be able to give the kind of publicity to the idea that's necessary to have it take hold in the population.
Right. Well, we have seen some efforts. I think we're somewhat ineffectual. You know, George H.W. Bush promoted the Points of Light. And Colin Powell had an organization, still has it, called America's Promise, which encourages volunteerism. But their presentation is very anodyne, you know. They didn't link this kind of volunteerism to some broader theme of knitting the social fabric and repairing the social fabric and exposing people to healthy norms. You know, it's like any answer in politics. Somebody's going to have to perceive it to be in their political self-interest to do that. And, yeah.
Any candidates in mind?
Well, let's think about did anybody even come close to that stuff, just to see if there's any.
Marianne Williams.
Yeah, she did in her own kind of nutty way. Yeah, well, she did kind of say that the solutions to our politics lie outside politics. So she had her moment. Yes, sir.
So I'm very sympathetic to what you argued on the role of the federal government in particular in the decline of civil society. But I don't feel like you really answered the questions that have been raised about the maybe inward unraveling of bourgeois norms. So for instance, like Anna's question there made me recall some crazy number I saw once that in London at the turn of the 19th century, 1 in 4 women had been prostitutes or were prostitutes actively. No, it seems, what in the world was the male libido then or something? But in fact, it was because there were marriages, right? And marriage, if a strong sense of marriage, put certain limitations that might only be met outside of marriage through prostitution, or that would encourage prostitution. So I'm just saying, it's saying that like if you read Mandeville about this, for instance, makes the case that in fact a flourishing republic would make room for prostitution in order to, it actually supports strong marriage by providing this outlet. And this number from London suggests, well, maybe there's some empirical validity to that. That the decline of marriage then could lead to correspondingly a decline in what we consider a social vice too. So I'm just wondering that the bourgeois values that you praise sound great, but isn't the reason that many people aren't living them is that they feel a certain freedom from being freed from them, that if we were to return to them, would feel intolerable to people today and would have corresponding social vices that we have, not entirely, but more left behind. So again, I'm very sympathetic to the attack on federal government spending as crowding out these activities and to the other things you pointed to, but I don't think you really made the case that the internal coherence of these bourgeois values would allow for a real whole-scale return to them after having tasted the freedom from those values that people have for the last 3 generations or more.
Well, you raise a lot of questions. And there's a difference between kind of not living in a stifling small town, Sinclair Lewis, Main Street, and Abbot environment, and living in a libertine society. And we're veering toward the libertine. And I think that when I'm urging, and Charles Murray has made this argument too, that elites need to preach what they practice. That actually, I think successful upper middle class and upper middle class families are staying married, divorce rates are going down, illegitimacy rates are going down, teen pregnancy rates are going down. And so I think that we have veered toward the libertine and we're shrinking from it. And what I'm urging is that people preach what they practice so we continue to shrink from it. Now, does that mean we want to go back to some stifling Victorian environment? I don't know what Victorian marriages were like, so I'm not sure I want to touch that question in terms of its details.
I agree.
But by the way, I think those figures about prostitution were an aspect of early industrialization and the displacement of people and deep urban poverty. And over time, as conditions have improved, apart from social norms, just sheer material improvement diminishes the need for people to do, horrible things like that to themselves.
Right. I guess another way to frame it would be that the civil society you describe, and truly, couldn't you say it works better in more parochial environments than what many people today would be willing to tolerate?
Well, I think that's a question, but so the LDS Church has a very robust civil society, and I think there's some evidence that some people feel stifled by that. Does that mean that people would rather live without any coherent social framework? I don't think that's the case.
Yeah, but that's not I don't think that's what the critics of patronizing or the way that philanthropy, say, was framed in the past would have said, well, we're all in for libertinism and complete social disintegration. I think there was something to that criticism, saying that this works best in a parochial environment. We don't want that. Or we want less of that, at least.
Well, could it be that some people want that more parochial environment, and that we're in an era of, bowling alone and kind of frayed community, and could it be that people actually want some restoration of community and physical ties, and that could be just as true? Dimitri?
Sorry for this
Oh,
question, but this is
okay.
something a bit different. But I was wondering if you have thoughts on the role of labor unions historically, or the changing role of labor unions as civil society organs. Because late 19th, early 20th century, labor unions would put together, or worker societies would build libraries for their works. I think the MIT University Library was originally a workers' library that was then donated to the university, and they would facilitate all sorts of these sorts of formative activities. Well, I was just wondering if you had thoughts on whether unions still play that role, or if they've been corrupted in the same kind of way that other civil society institutions have been.
The boss of his union is now being accused of stealing $1 million from the.
That's true.
From,
Graduate students are in the United Auto Workers of America right now.
That's right.
Oh, that's right, yeah.
Yes, and
Yeah, he was just indicted yesterday.
Yeah.
that's right. So indignation is swelling amongst the graduate students.
Well, he was corrupted by something. I would say that the UAW was corrupted by crony capitalism. There was a kind of a Galbraithian affluent society that thought that there was going to be 3 automakers and that was it, and it was going to go on forever, and they could just extract high wages. I remember once I was a kid in Cleveland. I was walking from the bus to the dentist, and right in front of me, a young man got hit by a car. Not too seriously, but seriously enough that his mother had picked him up, was bent over him, and said, "Are you sure you're okay? The union will pay for it." And I said, "Oh, that's interesting." So there was a kind of a, real core function that unions were playing. And, there's my colleague Oren Cass has written about a new role for unions in a gig economy as a more decentralized resource for people. There's a woman in New York who has something called the Freelancers Union. So I think it's possible that unions can morph back into something that's more generally supportive of their workers' human capital, if you will, to use jargon. And, you know, you don't have to look too much past Lech Wałęsa to realize that independent labor is a force of civil society. And he changed the rules.
I think you've satisfied us.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much, Howard, for coming, and this has been a lovely one.
Thanks so much for having me. It's an honor to be part of this lineup.